Hello and welcome to ETH201 Business Ethics and Corporate Social Responsibility. This is lecture 4 in week 5 in the first trimester of 2020. In this lecture, we're going to look at aspects of corporate social responsibility and corporate governance. And as we look at those aspects of corporate social responsibility and corporate governance, what we're trying to do is link the way a firm is governed to achieve corporate social responsibility. We're going to look at the theory and practice behind that and the perspectives on CSR and governance. In accounting, you may well have dealt with governance in a different way, in a narrower way than the way that we're dealing with it here. You may well have dealt with it in a legalistic way. We're looking at it from a broader ethical perspective. So let's get started. As before, these slides are based on the resources from the instructor's textbook plus other adaptations that I've added, and consistent with what we've done with the other recorded lectures, I'm going to break the lecture into chunks, and there'll be some video activities or some websites for you to visit in between each of these chunks. There are 4 key objectives that we are looking at, that we are addressing in this topic, in this module. We are going to define corporate social responsibility and corporate governance, and that leads us to having an idea of what corporate moral responsibility is. We're going to define a broad and narrow economic views of corporate social responsibility and explore the 3 key arguments in the debate related to corporate social responsibility. Now, 3 of the key arguments are about the narrow view of corporate social responsibility. But what we're going to do is we're going to relate 2 and 3 together. We're going to present them together. So we're going to talk about the narrow view of corporate social responsibility, and then we're going to look at the debates around the narrower view. Then we're going to look at the broader view and look at the debates around the broader view. Give us a nice, neat little package to discuss. And finally, we're going to look at the importance of institutionalizing ethics. This is the things that corporations can do within their organization to encourage and support ethical behavior and corporate social responsibility. And a key way we're going to look at that is we're going to look at the stakeholder approach to corporate governance and to corporate social responsibility. Note, again, in some of the other courses, we may have a different model of stakeholders. There are many different models of stakeholders. We're going to use a specific model within this module, within this unit in the course. It's a little bit different to the one used in strategy. It's a little bit different to the one used in Introduction to Management. I want to remind you again that theories and frameworks and models are a simplification of reality that enables us to have a lens in which we can view issues that may be confronted by business. Okay, so let's get started with some definitions. Objective 1, define corporate social responsibility and corporate moral responsibility. So firstly, I suppose we need to define what a corporation is. A corporation is an entity that can endure beyond the natural lives of its members and can be sued or can sue as an entity. The entity can own property and borrow funds for ventures that have limited liability. It can actually borrow funds beyond that. Other forms of corporation can also borrow funds. And limited liability means that members are liable for the debts of the corporation only to their extent of investment. So a corporation is a business that exists as a separate entity. It can be an organization, it can be a not-for-profit, it can be a for-profit, it can even be a government agency. But it's a corporation set up as almost as a person that has the ability to borrow, to lend, to be sued, to own, and to sue others, to own property. But it limits the liability of the individual to the extent of their investments. Now, you've all done business law, you've all done some accounting topics. you would know that there are, in some cases, laws that create additional responsibility on the owners of a corporation related to their behaviour and their governance. I'm not going to focus so much on those today. We're just going to use this broader definition. Corporate governance is the next thing I want to define for you. Corporate governance is the system of rules and practice and processes in the organisation that enables the organisation to be administered and controlled. Corporate governance tends to be a formal process, and the formal process is what you've probably talked about in accounting topics. But there are also informal processes of corporate governance, unwritten laws, unwritten rules, unwritten practices, but that extend the way or create a set of expectations in the organisation about how people in the organisation should behave, how the organisation should operate. These are underlying principles. Now, in strategy, sometimes these are mentioned in a specific statement. There are organisations that, for example, some of the tech organisations that make a big thing about having a socially responsible statement. Things like do no harm or improve people's welfare through the application of technology. So these issues related to corporate governance extend beyond written rules, extend beyond practices. It extends to the point, to the place where the organisation is actually operating. The way they do business. And sometimes there's a mismatch between the public statements of a firm about what they're doing and the real practices that exist. Corporate social responsibility is an expanded set of expectations on business beyond their financial and economic obligations that incorporate the social and environmental impacts on the business. A quick mention of financial and economic obligations. Again, in accounting topics, you would have heard of the concept of agency theory and where firms have owners, and the owners have an economic interest, and the agents in that organisation, the managers, are employed to run the firm to achieve the economic interest of the owners. That's a narrower view of social responsibility because it's just an economic and financial obligation. Corporate social responsibility takes a broader view and looks at not only financial and economic obligations now and in the future, but also social, government, consumer, supplier, environment, and the impacts the firm has on those things, or the impact that those groups of stakeholders have on the business. So there's a number of corporate social responsibility stances that exist. And those corporate social responsibility stances, again, different to the model that you may have been exposed to in strategy, can be shown in this pyramid diagram. A hierarchy of responsibilities. Economic responsibilities of the firm are to be profitable. Now, that's the foundation on which all firms exist. If you're not profitable, you don't survive. In not-for-profits, profitability can be measured through sustainability, to the fact the organisation in fact continues to exist because it's meeting its financial obligations to provide the services that it's providing or to complete the advocacy that it's completing. So there is always an economic aspect even in not-for-profits. The legal responsibilities the firm has, which is to obey the law, because the law that businesses operate in is the framework that says you are allowed to be a limited liability company. You're able to limit the liability for your actions from the individuals, but you have to follow this set of rules and regulations in this societal pact for us to enable you to operate. It's society's view of rights and wrongs within the market economy, the mixed economy. It's important that firms follow the law, that firms play by the rules. There are some aspects of legal responsibilities that, because of certain societal pressures, create a legal responsibility that is about the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. And that's the grey area that exists between legal responsibilities and ethical responsibilities. And in a common law setting such as Australia, in an adversarial legal system, sometimes the debates on interpretation of the law are about the spirit of the law and what it was intended to do, so that it can be applied as the letter of the law that firms need to operate by. And we also have organisations like the ACCC, and the Department of Justice Consumer Affairs Division that can come up with agreements or arrange agreements with firms to behave in a particular way against the legislation that may in fact be an interpretation of the legislation that enables them to move forward without necessarily having to go into an adversarial legal process. The agreement, for example, by Primus Telecommunications not to have door-to-door salesmen is an example of this. Not to have direct marketing as well. So what was happening with Primus Telecommunications, allegedly, was that they were sending out these casual door-to-door contractors that would go to door-to-door and say, look, we've got this great telecommunications deal, this great phone deal for you, we want you to switch. And in that switching process, the consumer could say yes or no. But the functional process that allegedly Primus had was that they had a set of, they had no real control, because legally you're supposed to give the 21-week cooling off period, they're supposed to have a signed document. So when these contractors would go out, they would sign people without their knowledge. They'd check a letterbox to find out the name and address of the person. They'd write that name and address. They'd fake a signature. They'd indicate that they're back to Primus, that they had been they'd been successful in that sale. They'd get their commission. 3 months later, somebody would get their phone bill from the new from Primus and say, "Hang on, I'm not with Primus. What's happened?" They go back to the company and the company would say, well, we've got a signed document that you transferred from your previous provider to us. It was a fake signature. Now, that's illegal. Clearly, that's illegal. And the regulator could have charged them, and in fact did take some legal action, to my knowledge. But as well as that, what they did was they came up with an agreement that because you have been so bad at controlling what is happening, you are no longer allowed to use that you must agree not to use that marketing method anymore. This door-to-door marketing method where you're going out with no control, cold calling people to get them to change phone companies. Now that example, which you can find casework on, is actually also an example that I personally experienced because it happened to us in Queensland. And it happened to many other people in Queensland that I know that have spouses or are in fact themselves of Asian descent. Because this particular scam was preying on non-English speaking background individuals. And they assumed that non-English speaking background individuals, it would appear that the people involved in the marketing, the door-to-door contractors, believed that they could scam non-English speaking background people because they'd have less ability to complain. Now, so that's an example of a legal responsibility to obey the law that ends up being more than a legal responsibility because it becomes an undertaking. So it's between legal and ethical. The next level of corporate social responsibility is ethical responsibility. The responsibility for businesses to be ethical. What is right? What is just? What is fair? To avoid harm. Now, over the next weeks, we're going to talk about a lot of these legal and ethical responsibilities as we deal with the other aspects of how business operate. The pinnacle in this particular model of corporate social responsibility is philanthropic. To be a good corporate citizen, to contribute resources to the community, to improve quality of life. Now, as I said, there are other models of corporate social responsibility and stances, but this is the broad one we're using in this particular unit. Philanthropic originally developed predominantly in market economies like the US and Singapore in particular, where it was seen that being a good corporate citizen by donating, by having charitable organisations, by having trusts, by contributing to support the community. So in a way, in areas where the government wasn't seen as the provider, or there was ideological reasons for the government not to be provider, because the government would therefore tax businesses, businesses would make a strong effort to be philanthropic. Now, philanthropic may or may not be motivated by altruistic reasons. It may be just a transactional reason to be a good corporate citizen. Sorry, just getting a little bit of echo through my headphones there. That's better. Now I can hear myself once rather than twice. Let's keep going to the next two components of this first objective. Corporations have moral agency. Moral agency is similar to individual agency that we talked about earlier in the course, where the individual has the right or the actions and the moral actions that can act as a moral agent as an individual. Corporations are legal agents because they're a legal entity, but you can argue that they also have moral agency. This is in part because in many countries, corporations are seen as having the same status and functions in society as a human being. They have the right to borrow money. They have the right to sue and be countersued. They exist independently of the people who own them, the investors, because the investors have limited liability. They can, by various rules, if we look at different things that happen, for example, in America, they can lobby because of the right to, because individuals and therefore corporations, because they are like individuals, have the right to use money to influence political aspects. They can own property. They can enter into contracts. So the argument is if corporations have a legal identity almost as a person, and in some countries they're defined as people, or they're said to be the equivalent of an individual, equivalent of a person, they should also have the moral responsibilities, the moral agency of a person, and therefore should be held responsible for their actions. But the balance for that is that if these corporations exist as individuals, where does that, as people, effectively as people with their own moral agency, where does that leave responsibility for the individuals in the organisation? What you end up with is, because the individuals in the organisation are the people that are making decisions. The size and impersonal structure of a corporation can result in the diffusion of responsibility. It's difficult to assign individual responsibility because a corporate structure may mean that many, many people are involved in actions. And who should be responsible? Should it be the board of directors? Should it be managers? Should it be the CEO or the CFO? Who should be responsible? Should it be the individual who's broken the rules, who causes harm? How should we attribute that responsibility? Should we accept that people can hide behind a corporation or abrogate their responsibility by hiding behind a corporation and not have any personal responsibility for actions? Which is correct? Are these corporations to be held responsible, or are the individuals in the corporations to be held responsible? That's not mutually exclusive. It's not mutually exclusive. In fact, there are laws that exist, like the industrial manslaughter law, that has been brought about because of terrible behaviour, allegedly, by particular construction company corporations who didn't maintain appropriate safety levels on their sites. So there's a law that's been produced that there are other companies that haven't maintained appropriate safety as well. But the driving force for this, the industrial lobby force of this, came from the construction industry. So there is a law about industrial manslaughter which requires and makes responsible people within the organisation for deaths or injuries related to individuals in the industrial manslaughter statute. So if the building collapses because the company hasn't ensured that there's proper safety equipment to stop that building collapsing during constructions, the individuals can be charged with industrial manslaughter. And there's been a lot of hullabaloo, a lot of conflict about that in the media. But we can go back a bit further and say, well, hang on, that's always been the case in some other business. If you are working on a road and you do not ensure the safety of your workers, one, or put the bollards in the correct position, and the guy with the stop sign doing his job properly or her job properly to manage this construction site, and a car crashes and someone's injured, you can be charged with manslaughter. So it's all, and that's been an individual responsibility for the people working on the site, manslaughter, and also a range of other causing injury type illegal things. Not a lawyer, giving you this example. So there's always this underlying belief that individuals should be held responsible, but there's always this murkiness about who is responsible for something happening in the organisation. If you're working in an office and the roof is leaking, and you've reported as an individual that the roof is leaking, and you reported that upward in your chain of management, and nothing's happened to fit the facts that the roof is leaking water, and in the evening when the cleaner's there, the roof's leaking, they step in and they get electrocuted because the roof's leaked onto some electrical cable and the person is killed. Are you responsible? Is the corporation responsible? Is the manager responsible? Is the property manager? Who's responsible? You get this murkiness about who should be responsible for the safety of individuals. And that's why we have public liability insurance and other things like that. Corporations will always seek, one would suggest, many corporations would seek to blame an individual to protect the corporation. And that's one of the moral quandaries that we're going to talk about later in this course. Many corporations behave in a way that's positive towards their staff, to protect their staff, to ensure their health. And I suppose we've seen that in some of the responses, the proactive responses to COVID virus, the way the companies have operated. Okay, so we're going to take a break now, and then after that we're going to come back and look at objectives 2 and 3.